Hello and welcome back to the Healing Motherhood Podcast. Today we are unveiling the unspoken. We are addressing the impact of birth trauma. Birth trauma is something that nobody talks about. And what happens when nobody talks about something is that the people who experience that something, they end up suffering in silence, right? They don't understand what's wrong with me. Why am I feeling this way? Why can't I just bond with my baby? Why can't I stop thinking about this birth experience? Why every time I close my eyes do I feel like I am back in the OR or in whatever was happening when they experienced that trauma? And what I want us to do today is take a moment to normalize talking about birth trauma, because there are a lot of people walking around who don't even realize that their birth had been traumatic. And even if it wasn't traumatic, a lot of people going around thinking, oh, it's just normal to have a crappy birth. And it's almost something that people bond over. Whereas it is not okay. Let's stop normalizing this. Let's shift the narrative, because it is not okay to hate the day that your baby was born. It is not okay to hate the day your baby was born. And it is okay that you feel that way right now. Okay. This is heavy. Let's shift the narrative, because there are a lot of people right now who really don't like their birth experience, and those feelings are valid. And it doesn't have to stay that way. I think there are people who talk about birth trauma, thank God, bless them, who are normalizing these feelings, and you don't have to stay stuck with those feelings. Healing is possible. So today, I want to just touch on the impact of birth trauma, because it's just not something we hear talked about enough. We don't have this everyday common knowledge of birth trauma. So when we have a friend who's experiencing something, they're scared to speak up. When we're the one experiencing something, we can be scared to speak up and say, oh my gosh, I feel sad all of the time. I feel like the day my baby was born was literally the worst day of my life. And those things don't feel safe to say because we haven't normalized this conversation. We haven't normalized the fact that birth trauma happens to a third, potentially more people. The numbers have gone up since COVID, but before COVID, it was 1/3 of birthers were coming away with birth trauma. Let's get a better understanding of this as a society so that we can help the people that we love, so that we can help ourselves when something like this happens. Okay, sorry for that little rant, but let's dive a little bit deeper into this, okay? Birth trauma. I explained a little bit about birth trauma last week. I will link the video if I figure out how to do that, just up here where people link videos. But if you're listening to the podcast, just go back to episode 1 where I start to define birth trauma. Birth trauma is any time that a birth is perceived to have been traumatic by the person giving birth. And it's not something that we all have the words for, right? When I first heard the word birth trauma, I was like, that's ridiculous. Trauma is for people coming home from war. PTSD is something that soldiers have, not something that mothers have. And so when you watch that episode, you will understand that trauma is really for anybody. From a child who experiences something that we may not even think would be traumatic to the birth of a child, right? Any of these things have the potential to be traumatic if the memory is stored in that way in the brain. So with a traumatic memory, The memory doesn't fade like a normal memory would. With a traumatic memory, it almost feels like you are back there in that moment all over again. So I dive a lot deeper into that in episode 1. Go back if you need more of a definition of birth trauma. However, birth trauma tends to be something that we not only have the name for in the early postpartum time, but it's also scary to voice that we feel like something's wrong with us. And I remember being in that place. I remember we had on our fridge after my son was born a list of signs of postpartum depression and postpartum anxiety. And I remember multiple times going up to this list like, there is something wrong with me and I don't know what it is. And it's not on this list, so I must be fine, but I don't feel fine. What is wrong with me? Why am I experiencing this? Why can I not connect with this baby? Why am I so angry at my husband? Why can't I stop researching about my birth experience, the complications that I had? Why can't I stop thinking about it? Why, when I close my eyes, am I literally transported back into the operating room, right? So let's take a minute to talk about the impact on the brain. Trauma literally changes our brain, and I don't want you to latch onto that as a thing that you have to keep as a part of your identity. Yes, trauma changes the brain, and the really cool thing about the brain is that it has the ability to change and learn and adapt. We have what's called neuroplasticity, and it is incredible the way that our brain can change, right? And there's so much research on the different ways to change the brain. I mean, even looking at like meditation has this impact on the brain that it's just so cool. I could geek out on that for hours, but today what we're talking about is the impact of birth trauma. So let's talk about it. So there are three areas of the brain that change with birth trauma. Okay? So let me just make sure I have my notes so that we get this right and clear and I don't stumble on words, okay? So we have the amygdala, which is the area of the brain that is responsible for processing emotions. It is also the part of the brain that tells us when there's danger. This is like the alarm center of the brain, the amygdala, okay? And the amygdala becomes hyperactive as an effect of birth trauma, right? And when it becomes hyperactive, it creates this heightened fear and anxiety. It is saying there is danger everywhere, right? And so this can result in hypervigilance. Remember, we talked about hypervigilance this past week as one of the signs that you have birth trauma. So if you want a little bit deeper of a description of hypervigilance, you're going to go back to episode 2 for that, okay? And that hypervigilance is where we are ultra aware of any danger in our space. It is where we feel like falling asleep is dangerous. Not that the hospital video helps with that one. Just saying, if you know, you know. Drop a comment if you remember in the US, where I am in Nebraska, we had to watch this video on shaken baby syndrome. And I'm pretty sure there was one on safe sleep. And so you're this new mom trying to nurse your baby at night or feed your baby at night. And mine had an undiagnosed tongue tie for a while, and we never treated it. So I'm up half the night, terrified to fall asleep in the recliner. And then I will never forget a neighbor telling me a horror story about a family where the parent did fall asleep in the recliner with the baby. And another neighbor, she was a mom, and she looked at him and she's just like, shh, don't even go there right now, because she can kind of see and remember the fragility of those early postpartum weeks and months and the complete lack of sleep and the kind of survival mode that you're already in with a newborn baby. But on top of that, having the hypervigilance of birth trauma makes that feel even bigger than it already is, right? So another impact of the amygdala is then, as it is hyperactive, you can have a little bit more emotional reactivity, right? Making it hard to regulate your emotions effectively. So that was about the amygdala. The next part of the brain that changes is the hippocampus, and the trauma can shrink the hippocampus. And the hippocampus is what helps us with our memory consolidation, our context processing, right? And so that means that with a smaller hippocampus, we're having a hard time processing that traumatic memory. And this is where we have flashbacks and intrusive thoughts, is because our brain is trying so hard to process this memory and to put it into kind of a longer term storage, right? It wants to process this memory so that we can start to fade the memory in a more normal way, right? Whereas I know earlier in this video, I had explained how a traumatic memory doesn't fade over time the same way that a normal memory would, okay? So that's what ties into those flashbacks and those intrusive thoughts and even those nightmares, right? What's another word for this? It is the kind of re-experiencing or reliving that traumatic memory. The last area of the brain that I want to talk about is the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is what makes our brains amazing as human beings, right? This is what we use for responsible decision making. And I think it's around age 25 that it even completes its development. So when you think about like teenage decisions and teenagers acting like they are invincible, their prefrontal cortex hasn't finished developing yet, right? They are, impulsive and their emotions are big. So when our prefrontal cortex, which is made less active after trauma, it makes it harder for us to control our impulses. It makes it harder to regulate emotions. It makes it really difficult to make rational decisions, right? Or to manage our stress. So those are 3 parts of the brain that are impacted by birth trauma. And so that is why some of the resources down below that I will share the link to, they are kind of tips and tools and tricks to kind of trick your brain to get back into your prefrontal cortex when you are triggered and when your amygdala wants to just take over, right? So definitely dive into that resource. So we spent quite a bit of time on the impact on the brain. And so the way that birth trauma then affects the mother, right? Let's talk a little bit about toxic positivity. And I know that I've brought this up in previous episodes, and I know that I will bring it up in more, right? This toxic positivity makes it feel even less safe to talk about our experience and to get the support that we need. So toxic positivity after birth trauma sounds like all that matters is a healthy baby, right? It is when we are sharing that we really struggled and somebody says, at least you and the baby are okay, right? And I know that it is well-meaning, but it is invalidating. And what it does is it tells the mother that all that matters is that her baby was healthy. Her feelings don't matter. The way that her body was impacted don't matter. And the way that she felt during birth isn't important. But the truth is is that nothing matters more than the mother and her needs being met and her emotional welfare being met, taken care of, because when we have a mother who is well nourished, who is emotionally cared for and emotionally healthy, that all impacts the baby. So we need to take this focus, right, that everybody has on holding the baby and cuddling the baby. Oh, how's the baby? How's this? How's that? And we need to take some of that attention and direct it towards the mother. Okay? So when we look at the other effects on mother with this birth trauma, we see people coming in to visit this baby and they're not bringing food, they're not taking care of the house, they're just coming to hold the baby, while then the mother gets up and she uses that time to clean or to do whatever it is needs done. And really what she needs to focus on is healing, right? Maybe debriefing her story with somebody, maybe having love on her, taking care of her emotional and physical needs, as opposed to just coming to see and snuggle a new baby. So let's talk a little bit about the effects on babies. When there is birth trauma involved, depending on the complications, depending on the ability to access skin to skin, depending on the feeding impacts, NICU time, these can all have an impact on bonding. So not only the immediate physical impact on bonding, but then when we talk about being impacted in the brain by birth trauma, that impacts the mother's ability to bond and connect with baby emotionally, even once they're home, right? It impacts her ability to tune into baby's behavioral cues, to understand what it is they need and start to build that bond and connection. I will say that the research has found that even when that bonding isn't developed right away, it doesn't seem to have a long-term impact, which is incredible. And so we can let go of any guilt if we are past this stage. We can say it's okay. It's not, whatever idiosyncrasies they are having now is not because of your birth trauma. It's not because you struggled to bond with them. Okay? Some things just are. And I know that for me personally, it's easy to say, oh, that's because of the birth trauma. Oh, that's because of the birth trauma. And then to kind of take a little bit of blame on myself. But really, we're giving it so much more power than it has. And there is no way for us to know that that's because of the birth trauma. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about coping strategies with these impacts. In the link below to my free course on healing after a difficult birth, there is a whole section on ways to calm your nervous system and kind of tap into that prefrontal cortex and tone down the impacts of the amygdala, okay? So you can use those body-based strategies to support you in coping with these things. If you're wanting to look into therapy options, make sure that you are finding somebody who is trauma-informed. They maybe have brain spotting as an option or EMDR as an option. Otherwise, there are other options as well, right? Debriefing with a midwife. I do debriefs. I know a few doulas who offer debriefs. And that's a great option as well to kind of start processing that. When a person debriefs their birth within those kind of first 6 weeks, there's a really cool opportunity there for the story to be processed and stored as a normal memory, which is really neat. And then every time that a story is debriefed, there is the opportunity to infuse empathy into that story when we are telling it to people who have the capacity to provide empathy, preferably people who are trained in debriefing difficult births. There's also the opportunity to start strengthening bonds with your baby by doing things that you enjoy. Baby massage can really help. Little baby games that you might learn at your public library to play with babies, or you might even look up, some baby games to do. Things like peekaboo, the little pigs thing on the toes. We did this bouncy thing, Mother and Father and Uncle John, and that kind of thing. Playing little games once they start to be at an age where that's possible. Feeding times can also be a great time to reconnect and bond with baby. Even if you are feeding from a bottle, there's the opportunity to do a little skin to skin. And I did skin to skin with my babies up until 2 years, especially when they would be ill. That skin to skin can help regulate their body temperature. It helps them feel safe and be able to bond with you. I think it's really important to emphasize that eye contact when you're feeding. I know how easy it is to get caught up on your device, getting on these motherhood Facebook groups or Instagram or TikTok while nursing, especially if you're cluster feeding. Or even I used to, those early postpartum days when they're like sleep nursing, I would binge watch certain shows. And I think that, do what you got to do, but also remember the way that screen time is going to impact us, even our body posture, right? As your head comes forward, more in a kind of prey-like state, right? This alert state is what our phones are creating. And that's going to reinforce that alertness, right? On a somatic level. So I just want to take a minute to re-emphasize the importance of normalizing these discussions, normalizing sharing our stories. And I want to just really hit home the point that healing is possible. Your story, your brain, it's all malleable, right? And then there is this opportunity for what we call post-traumatic growth after a traumatic event. And I don't want you to feel like that's something you need to be able to jump to right this moment if you are in those early stages. However, I want to make sure that you know that healing is possible for you. Healing is possible for each person. So I hope that you will hit subscribe as we talk even more deeply about these topics in the coming weeks. And I hope that if you need the resources below, you will hop in there. There is a great resource for how you can communicate whatever it is you're feeling with your loved ones, with your support team. I had somebody take this course and use it in their therapy sessions to dive more deeply into their healing journey, which was really a cool thing to witness. So use those tools. I made them for you, and I just want to see you heal in whatever way works best for you. Thank you so much for being here. See you next time.